I don't know why I chose to go camping. Maybe I thought being alone in the woods would help clear my mind. Maybe I wanted to be away from the noise of the world, away from people who kept looking at me with pity, telling me they were sorry for my loss. Maybe I just wanted to disappear for a while. It had been 7 months since Lisa died. 7 months of waking up and feeling like there was no reason to get out of bed. 7 months of sitting in our house, staring at her empty chair, her coffee mug still sitting where she left it. I had tried everything people suggested: therapy, exercise, even picking up old hobbies. Nothing worked. The grief sat in my chest like a stone, heavy and unmoving. So one morning, without really thinking about it, I packed a bag, grabbed my tent, and drove out to the woods. I chose a spot far from the main campground, deep in the forest where no one else would be. It was a small clearing by a narrow creek, surrounded by thick pines. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds, and the occasional snap of a branch under some unseen animal's weight. It was exactly what I wanted: silence. The first night was uneventful. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and ate a can of soup. The stars were bright above me, the night air crisp. I sat there for hours, staring at the flames, feeling numb. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up to the sound of twigs snapping. I opened my eyes, my heart suddenly racing. The fire had burned down to embers, casting weak orange light around my camp. The trees loomed tall and dark, their shadows shifting in the dim glow. I listened, holding my breath. Another snap, closer this time. A deer, I told myself. A raccoon. Maybe even just the wind knocking loose branches. But it didn't feel like that. It felt like something watching. I forced myself to breathe. I wasn't going to let my mind play tricks on me. I wasn't going to let grief turn into paranoia. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and aimed it toward the trees. Nothing. Just endless forest. Still, I barely slept that night. The next morning, I told myself I had imagined it. I made coffee, ate some granola bars, and decided to go for a hike. Maybe moving would help clear my head. I followed a narrow trail that led deeper into the woods. The air was cool, the scent of damp earth and pine filling my lungs. I walked for hours, not thinking, just moving. That was when I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. They were fresh, pressed into the soft dirt. Not boot prints either, bare feet. I stopped, my stomach tightening. I wasn't near any main trails. As far as I knew, no one else was out here. I followed the prints for a while, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a hiker had wandered off trail. Maybe someone liked walking barefoot. But as I kept going, the prints started to look wrong. They weren't shaped right. The toes were too long, the arch too high, and they weren't spaced evenly like a normal person walking. Some were deep, others barely there, as if whoever made them had been moving strangely. I turned back. The hike back to camp felt longer. Every sound made my skin crawl. The rustling leaves, the distant crack of a branch. By the time I reached my tent, the sun was low in the sky. I built another fire, trying to shake the uneasy feeling growing in my chest. I sat there until dark, staring at the flames, listening. Then I heard it again. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching. I held my breath, my pulse hammering in my ears. The sounds weren't coming from one place. They were circling me. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, my hands shaking. Just an animal, I whispered to myself. That's all it is. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I aimed the flashlight at the trees. The beam swept over trunks, branches, empty space. Then, for a split second, it caught something. A shape. It was gone before I could get a clear look, but I saw enough. Pale skin, too tall, eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. My stomach twisted. I turned off the flashlight, my breath coming fast. I listened. The night was silent. Then I heard it. A breath, not mine. Slow, deliberate, just beyond the firelight. I grabbed my knife, my fingers wrapped so tightly around the handle they hurt. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Watching, waiting. I stayed awake all night, gripping the knife, barely breathing. When the sky started to lighten, I packed up my tent in record time. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely tie the straps on my backpack. As I hoisted it onto my shoulders, I glanced back toward the trees one last time. Something was there, just at the edge of the clearing, tall, motionless, watching. I turned and walked away, forcing myself not to run. I followed the path back to my car, my pulse pounding in my throat. I didn't look back, not once. When I reached my car, I threw my gear into the trunk, got in, and locked the doors. My hands were still shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw something standing at the tree line. Too tall, too still. Then the road curved, and it was gone. I didn't stop driving until I was back home. I locked every door, shut every curtain, but I couldn't shake the feeling, like something had followed me, like something was still watching. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized something. The grief had felt like drowning, like being trapped under a weight I couldn't lift. But in those woods, for the first time in months, I had felt something else. Fear. Real, tangible, immediate fear. And somehow it had cut through the numbness. I didn't know what I had seen out there. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe it was something real, something I wasn't meant to see. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going back. It was supposed to be a short break from work, a weekend trip out into the woods. My boss, a senior officer at the department, had been the one to suggest it. He wasn't the type you'd expect to enjoy the outdoors. Rigid, always in uniform, the kind of man who drank his coffee black and never let his guard down. But he swore by these solo camping trips, said they helped clear his mind. When he invited me along, I was surprised, but I didn't say no. We set out early on a Friday morning, the drive stretching long past the last gas station, past the paved roads and into gravel and dirt. The place he picked was deep in the woods, far from cell service, far from anything. I didn't mind, I wanted the quiet. The trees thickened as we drove, pine and oak stretching high, blotting out the sun in places. We didn't pass another car for miles. When we finally arrived, it was just a clearing near a small river, a flat spot for a tent, a fire pit from past campers, and the thick silence of the wild. We spent the first few hours setting up. The tent went up fast, the firewood was collected, and we ate a quick meal. By late afternoon, the air was already cooling, the sun dipping lower through the trees. Felt good to be out there. No noise except for the wind and the occasional rustling in the brush. As night fell, we sat by the fire, the orange glow casting long shadows across the trees. My boss was quiet, staring into the flames. I could tell something was on his mind, but I didn't ask. It wasn't until later, when we turned in for the night, that things started to feel off. I woke up sometime after midnight, unsure why. The fire had burned down to embers, a dim glow barely reaching beyond the tent. My boss was still asleep, steady breathing beside me. Then I heard it, soft but distinct. Footsteps, not an animal, not the rustling of a deer or the light scurry of a raccoon. These were slow, measured steps. Someone was outside. I stayed still, listening. The steps moved closer, stopping just outside the tent. I held my breath.
No flashlight, no voices.
Just silence and the feeling of being watched. Minutes passed. Then, just as suddenly as they came, the footsteps moved away. The sound of crunching leaves faded into the distance. I didn't sleep much after that. At first light, I stepped out, looking for signs of whoever had been there. Nothing.
No footprints. No disturbed brush.
But I knew what I had heard. My boss stirred, stepping out of the tent with a yawn. I didn't tell him what happened. Not yet. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I was just on edge. We spent the morning fishing at the river, cooking breakfast over the fire. For a while, it felt normal, until we found the first sign. About 100 yards from our campsite, just beyond where we had walked the night before, something was carved into a tree. Deep, deliberate slashes. Not from an animal. Not random. We stared at it for a long time. My boss didn't say anything, just ran a hand over the marks. Then, without a word, he turned back toward camp. I followed, my stomach uneasy. That night, we kept the fire high. I didn't mention the footsteps, but I could tell my boss felt it too. The shift in the air, the way the forest seemed too quiet. Hours passed. Then, just as the fire started to die down, we heard it. A snap, a crunch. Closer this time. My boss reached for his knife. I already had mine in hand. Something moved beyond the trees, just out of sight. Then, another sound, low, steady breathing. We weren't alone. I held still, my heart pounding. The breathing was too deep for an animal, too controlled. Then, just like the night before, it stopped. Nothing. We waited, listening. The silence stretched long, too long. Finally, after what felt like hours, my boss muttered under his breath and threw another log onto the fire. Neither of us slept that night. To first light, we packed up. Neither of us said it, but we both knew we weren't staying another night. As we loaded the truck, my boss stopped. There, in the dirt just beyond our camp, were footprints. Barefoot, human, leading right up to our tent. My stomach dropped. They hadn't been there the night before. Someone had been watching us while we slept. We didn't speak the whole drive back. I never went camping after that. I was never one for fancy hotels or big cities. I preferred being out in nature, away from noise and crowds, away from the artificial glow of streetlights and neon signs. That's why I decided to go camping alone in the French countryside one summer. I had planned everything carefully, mapping out my route, packing enough food, and choosing a quiet, isolated spot to set up my tent. It was supposed to be a simple, peaceful trip. Just me, the forest, and the open sky. I arrived in the late afternoon, driving my old car down winding country roads. The campsite I had chosen was deep in a wooded area, far from any major towns. There were no official campgrounds, no facilities, just raw nature. I liked it that way. I parked at the edge of a dirt path and carried my gear deeper into the woods, searching for a good place to set up. After walking for about half an hour, I found a small clearing near a river. It was perfect. The ground was mostly flat, the trees provided plenty of cover, and the water source was close. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and got to work preparing my camp. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. As the sun dipped lower, I lit a fire and made a simple meal. The flames flickered against the trees, casting long shadows. The isolation was comforting at first. No distractions, no responsibilities, just me and the quiet. Then, as I sat by the fire, I noticed something strange. A faint path, barely visible, led away from my clearing deeper into the forest. It wasn't on the map. It looked old, overgrown, like it hadn't been used in years. I hadn't noticed it when I set up camp. Maybe I had been too focused on finding a good spot. I felt an odd unease creep over me. Something about the path didn't sit right. It was too narrow for vehicles, too hidden for regular hikers. It looked like a trail that had been forgotten or abandoned. I shook off the feeling. There were probably plenty of old trails in the area. Nothing strange about that. As night fell, I climbed into my tent, zipped it up, and lay down, listening to the sounds of the forest. Crickets chirped, leaves rustled, and the distant flow of the river was steady and calm. I closed my eyes. Then, in the middle of the night, something woke me up. A sound, soft, faint, like footsteps on dry leaves. I held my breath, listening. The fire had died down, leaving only glowing embers. The woods were dark. The sound came again, slow, deliberate steps. Not an animal. Too steady, too controlled. I lay still, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. Then silence. I waited, barely breathing. Minutes passed. Nothing. No movement. No sound. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to unzip the tent just enough to peek outside. The clearing was empty. Nothing but trees and darkness. My firewood pile was untouched. My backpack still where I left it. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the forest settling, branches falling, an animal moving through the brush. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, everything seemed normal again. Sunlight filtered through the trees, birds chirped, and the river glistened in the daylight. The fear from the night before felt distant, almost silly. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. They weren't mine. I had been careful when setting up my tent, and my own tracks were clear. But these were different, larger, heavier, and they led from the overgrown path, stopping right in front of my tent before disappearing back into the woods. I stared at them, heart pounding. Someone had been here, watching, standing inches from where I had been sleeping. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a lost hiker, curious about my camp. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. A lost hiker would have called out. They wouldn't have stood there in silence. They wouldn't have turned back without a word. I decided to stay one more night. Maybe it was foolish, but I had come here for peace, and I didn't want to leave over some footprints. That evening, I made sure my fire was bigger, brighter. I set up a makeshift alarm, some empty cans tied to a string around my campsite. If anything moved through, I would hear it. Night came, the fire crackled, the forest stretched into darkness, and I sat there, listening. Then, just past midnight, the cans rattled. I jumped up, grabbing my flashlight. I shone it toward the path. Nothing. The trees swayed in the wind, but I saw no movement. No one. But I knew someone was out there. I stayed up the rest of the night, gripping the flashlight, waiting. The cans never rattled again. By morning, I had made my decision. I was leaving. I packed up quickly, stuffing my tent and gear into my bag. I barely ate. I just wanted to get out. As I hiked back to my car, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me. But the woods were still. Then, as I reached my car and unlocked the door, I noticed something that made my hands shake. Scratches on the door, deep, uneven, like someone had dragged a knife or a sharp rock across the paint. And below the scratches, a single footprint in the dirt. Large, heavy, facing my car. I didn't wait. I got in, started the engine, and drove as fast as I could, watching the forest shrink in my rearview mirror. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know what they wanted. But I know one thing, I was never alone in those woods. I had always loved the outdoors. Camping, hiking, being alone in nature. It gave me a sense of freedom that nothing else did. The modern world was too noisy, too crowded. Out in the wild, away from the endless hum of cars and voices, I felt like I could breathe properly. I had traveled to Japan for work a few years ago and decided to stay. I worked as a freelance photographer, taking odd jobs here and there, mostly nature photography. My weekends were often spent camping in the countryside, exploring forests, climbing mountains, and finding those untouched places that few people knew about. One weekend, I set my sights on a remote camping spot in the mountains of Nagano Prefecture. I had read about it in an old hiking forum. Hardly any tourists, no maintained trails, just pure wilderness. That's exactly what I wanted. A real challenge. I packed light but smart. A tent, a sleeping bag, a portable stove, a knife, a flashlight, extra batteries, a small first aid kit, and enough food and water to last 3 days. I also carried a satellite GPS just in case, but I didn't plan on using it. I prided myself on my navigation skills. The hike to the campsite was long and difficult. The further I went, the more the landscape changed. The trees grew taller, their branches twisting in ways that made the forest feel ancient. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No distant sounds of traffic, no human voices, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirping of birds. I set up camp in a small clearing near a stream. The ground was damp, but I found a dry enough patch for my tent. As the sun began to set, the temperature dropped quickly. I boiled some water for instant noodles, ate while listening to the distant hoots of an owl, then crawled into my tent, exhausted. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. Something felt wrong. I wasn't sure why I had woken up. The forest was silent, too silent. I had spent enough time camping to know that even at night, there was always some noise, crickets, the rustling of small animals, the occasional breeze shaking the trees. But now there was nothing. I lay still, listening. My tent was zipped up, and my sleeping bag was warm around me. I wanted to tell myself that I was imagining things, that my mind was playing tricks on me. Then I heard it. Faint crunch. Footsteps. Not an animal. Not the scurrying of a squirrel or the cautious steps of a deer. These were slow, deliberate footsteps. Someone was walking nearby. I held my breath. The footsteps continued, circling my tent. Not too close, but close enough. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. I kept my breathing as quiet as possible. The footsteps stopped. Then, after what felt like hours, they started again, moving away this time, fading into the forest. I lay awake until dawn. Morning brought some relief, but I couldn't shake the unease. I stepped out of my tent and looked around. The ground was covered in fallen leaves and twigs, making it hard to spot footprints. But I knew what I had heard. I told myself it was probably another camper, maybe a hunter, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. This place was too remote. I considered packing up and heading back early, but my pride wouldn't let me. I had come all this way, and I wasn't about to turn back because of some strange noise in the night. I spent the day exploring, taking photographs of the dense forest, the way the light filtered through the branches. But I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like I wasn't alone. As the sun set, I built a small fire. The warmth was comforting, but the fire also made me feel exposed. I forced myself to eat. My appetite was gone, but I needed to keep my strength up. When I finally crawled into my tent, I made sure my knife was within reach. I woke up again. This time, it wasn't footsteps that woke me. It was the feeling of being watched. I lay still, heart pounding. I listened, then movement. Something was just outside my tent. I slowly reached for my flashlight. I didn't turn it on yet. I wanted to be sure. A shadow moved. The fabric of my tent shifted slightly, as if something or someone had brushed against it. I flicked on the flashlight. Silence. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside, shining my light into the darkness. Nothing, but the forest felt wrong. Then I saw it. Something was crouched low in the trees, just at the edge of the light. Not an animal, person. I couldn't make out their face, but they were there, unmoving, watching me. A cold wave of fear washed over me. My grip tightened on the knife. I didn't move. The figure didn't move either. Minutes passed. Then slowly they stood up. Even in the dim light, I could see how unnaturally long their arms were, how their posture was off. They turned and disappeared into the forest without a sound. I stayed awake until dawn again. As soon as the sun rose, I packed up. I didn't eat, didn't take any more photos. I just wanted to get out. The hike back felt different. The forest, once beautiful, now felt like it was pressing in on me. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure again. At one point, I found something on the trail. A small wooden doll, handmade with twisted limbs and hollow eyes. I didn't touch it. I walked faster. Took me longer than expected to reach my car. By the time I saw it, my legs were shaking from exhaustion. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, convinced that I would see someone standing at the tree line, watching me leave. I never went back to that place. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I camped after that, I made sure it was somewhere populated, somewhere with other hikers nearby. I still don't know who or what I saw that night, but I know one thing for certain. I was never alone in those woods, and whoever was out there, they had been waiting for me. That was an experience I'll never forget. Even now, years later, the memory of those footsteps, that figure in the dark, sends a chill down my spine. Some places aren't meant to be explored. Some things are better left unseen. And sometimes, when you think you're alone in the wild, you aren't. The chopper blades cut through the night, slicing the cold air as we moved over the dense forest. The mission brief had been simple: retrieve the bodies of 2 missing reconnaissance operatives who had failed to report back from a routine scouting mission. No signs of struggle, no distress signals, just silence. Their last known coordinates placed them somewhere deep in the mountains, far from any known enemy movement or civilian paths. I sat in the dim red glow of the cabin light, my rifle resting between my knees. My squad, 5 of us in total, remained silent, checking our gear, securing straps, adjusting night vision. We all had our own thoughts about this mission, but no one voiced them. Something felt off about it. Routine missions don't send an entire special operations unit into the middle of nowhere. The pilot's voice crackled in my earpiece, informing us we had a few minutes before landing. I tightened my gloves, double-checked my gear, and took a deep breath. I had done dozens of these before, but something about this one felt different. The chopper descended, the wind kicking up dirt and loose leaves as the skids touched down on a small clearing. We moved out fast, securing the area, scanning the tree line for movement. Nothing. The forest swallowed the sound of the chopper as it lifted off, leaving us in total silence. We moved quickly, following the last known coordinates of the missing operatives. Thick branches clawed at our gear as we weaved through the dense trees, our boots sinking into the damp earth. The air smelled of pine and rotting leaves, the weight of the forest pressing down on us. After 2 hours of moving uphill, we reached a small plateau. The last radio ping had come from somewhere close to this location. I scanned the area through my night vision, my heart thudding. There was no sign of them, no footprints, no drag marks, nothing. Then we found their camp. A small, hastily assembled shelter sat in the middle of a clearing, just big enough for 2 men to huddle inside. The fire pit was cold, the ashes scattered by the wind. Their gear was still here: rucksacks, water bottles, extra ammunition. But no sign of them. I felt something tighten in my chest. They wouldn't have left their weapons behind. We spread out, searching for any signs of movement. The trees loomed over us, branches twisting into the night sky. I found one of their radios half buried in the dirt near a fallen log. No damage, no blood, just sitting there, abandoned. Then we saw the first sign of trouble. A trail of footprints leading away from the camp. Uneven, erratic, like someone was stumbling. We followed. The prints led us deeper into the woods, winding through dense undergrowth. The wind had picked up, carrying the sound of rustling leaves and shifting branches. The farther we went, the heavier the air felt, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic. Then we saw it, the first body, slumped against a tree, half covered in leaves, eyes wide open. His rifle was still slung across his chest, his gear untouched. No wounds, no blood, just dead. I crouched next to him, checking for any signs of struggle. His face was frozen in an expression I couldn't place. Fear, pain, confusion. His skin was pale, his lips slightly parted as if he had been trying to say something when he died. Something was wrong. Soldiers don't just drop dead like this. No bullet wounds, no stab marks. We searched the body for any clues, notes, recordings, anything that could explain what happened. His comms unit was still on, but the battery was nearly drained. I signaled to the others. We needed to find the second body. Fast. We pressed on, moving slower now, more cautious. The second set of tracks led us farther into the woods, deeper into the unknown. The trees grew denser, the air colder. I felt it before I saw it, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. I glanced at my squad. They felt it too. No one said a word, but our movements became sharper, our grips on our rifles tighter. Then we found the second body, lying face down near the edge of a small ravine, his gear scattered around him. Unlike the first, his body was twisted unnaturally, his arm bent at an impossible angle. His face was partially buried in the dirt, but his eyes were open, staring at nothing. I checked for wounds. Again, nothing. No bullet holes, no stab wounds, just dead. Something wasn't right. Then we heard it, a noise, a rustling in the trees behind us. We turned as one, rifles up, scanning the darkness. Night vision painted the forest in shades of green, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. But we knew something was there. The feeling of being watched turned to something worse. The wind had stopped. The trees had gone still. The forest, alive with sounds just moments ago, had fallen into complete silence. We had to move. We retrieved what we could from the bodies, their tags, their gear, anything that could be useful. But we weren't staying any longer than necessary. We moved fast, pushing through the undergrowth, retracing our steps back to the exfil point. Every muscle in my body was tense, my senses on high alert. Then the noise came again, closer this time, something moving through the trees, staying just beyond our line of sight. We picked up the pace, the weight of our gear pressing down on us as we ran through the forest. The air was thick, suffocating. Every step felt heavier, as if the woods themselves were trying to slow us down. The feeling of being watched never left. We reached the clearing just as the chopper came into view. The pilot must have sensed the urgency in our voices because the moment we broke through the tree line, the engines roared louder, ready to take off the second we were on board. I didn't look back as we lifted off. As we rose above the forest, I allowed myself to breathe. The others were silent, their faces pale. No one said a word. The bodies had no wounds, no signs of struggle. They had simply died, and something had been watching us. Back at base, the autopsies confirmed what we already knew. No wounds, no toxins, no signs of foul play. It was as if their hearts had just stopped. The official report listed it as unknown causes. No further investigation. We knew better. I still think about that mission, about those woods, about whatever was out there with us that night. And I know one thing for certain: we were not alone. I had always preferred camping alone. Some people found it strange, but for me it was a way to clear my mind, to escape the noise of the city, to feel something real for a change. I didn't need the company of friends, didn't want the chatter or distractions. Just me, my tent, the trees, and the quiet. That year, I had picked a spot deep in the forests of Montana. It wasn't a popular campsite, which was exactly what I wanted. No marked trails, no designated fire pits, just raw wilderness. I had spent years honing my skills: fire making, tracking, finding clean water. I had everything I needed in my pack. The drive took most of the day, and by late afternoon, I found a clearing beside a slow-moving creek. The place felt perfect. The trees stood tall and thick, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sky. The ground was dry but soft, covered in layers of pine needles. No signs of recent human activity. No footprints. No trash. I set up my tent quickly. Years of doing this had made me efficient. The fire came next. I gathered dry wood, arranged it carefully, struck a match. Flames curled upward, warm and familiar. I cooked a quick meal, just beans and jerky. Simple. The first night passed uneventfully. I slept deeply, lulled by the distant sounds of an owl and the gentle rustling of the trees. The second day, I hiked. I didn't bring a GPS, just a map and compass. I liked relying on old methods. There was a ridge a few miles from my camp, and I wanted to see the view. The climb was slow but steady, and when I reached the top, I could see miles of untouched forest in every direction. No buildings, no roads, no smoke from other campfires, just endless green. I sat there for a while, enjoying the silence. It was on my way back that I noticed something odd. A tree, maybe 50 yards off my path, had deep gashes in its bark. Not claw marks, these were deliberate, straight cuts, as if someone had taken a knife or hatchet to it. They were fresh. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck. There was no reason for those marks to be there. No reason for anyone to be out here carving into trees. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe a hunter had passed through recently, maybe marking a trail. Still, I walked back to camp faster than before, keeping my ears open. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every noise felt sharper, closer. The wind through the trees sounded like footsteps. The cracking of a branch made my pulse jump. I told myself I was being paranoid. Then, around midnight, I heard something. It wasn't the wind, wasn't an animal. It was the sound of metal, something tapping against something hard. Rhythmic, faint, tap, tap, tap. I lay still, listening. It sounded like it was coming from the trees. I reached for my knife. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to see the edges of my tent. My ears strained, trying to pick apart the sound from the background noise of the forest. Tap, 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 then silence. I waited, my breath slow and controlled. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just a falling branch, a loose piece of wood shifting in the wind. Still, I kept the knife close to my chest as I drifted into uneasy sleep. The next morning, I checked the area. I walked the perimeter of my camp, looking for footprints, disturbed earth, anything. Nothing. Maybe I really had imagined it, but something felt wrong. I decided to stay close to camp that day. I gathered more firewood, checked my gear, made sure everything was in order. By afternoon, the sky darkened. Clouds rolled in, heavy with rain. I prepared for a storm, tightening my tent, making sure my fire would stay dry. As evening fell, the rain came down hard. The fire sputtered but stayed lit. I ate quickly, then sat inside my tent, listening to the downpour. Then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. I froze. The rain drowned out most sounds, but that tapping was still there. Faint, persistent. I gripped my knife and waited. Then the tapping stopped, replaced by something worse. Breathing, not mine. It was close. I held my breath, every muscle tense. The rain beat against my tent, masking other sounds, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. There was someone out there, someone standing just beyond the firelight. I stayed like that for what felt like hours. Eventually, the rain eased and the breathing faded. I didn't sleep. At first light, I made my decision. I was leaving. I packed my gear quickly, barely stopping to eat. My instincts screamed at me to go, to get out of those woods. As I was about to collapse my tent, I saw them. Footprints, not mine, fresh ones, circling my campsite. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my pack and started moving. I took a different route back to my truck, moving fast but quiet, checking my surroundings every few steps. The forest felt different now, no longer peaceful. Felt like something was watching me. Halfway back, I saw another tree with fresh marks carved into it. This time, there were more. Dozens of long, deliberate cuts. Some deep, some shallow. Not random, not an accident. I kept moving. The last stretch was the worst. My truck was parked on a dirt road, just out of sight beyond a thick patch of trees. As I got closer, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A single boot print, right next to my truck. Someone had been there. I didn't stop to check the rest. I threw my gear into the back seat, started the engine, and drove. I didn't look back. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. I just know that I wasn't alone, and that they had been watching me the whole time. It was a cold, wet evening when I set out into the woods. The rain had been falling on and off all day, leaving the ground soft and treacherous beneath my boots. I had planned this hunting trip for weeks, picking a remote spot in the Scottish Highlands where the forest stretched endlessly, untouched by towns or main roads. The isolation was perfect, and that was exactly what I wanted. I had arrived at my campsite earlier in the afternoon, just before the rain started. It wasn't much, just a small clearing with enough space for my tent, a fire pit, and a place to clean whatever I managed to hunt. The trees were dense around me, towering pines and gnarled oaks, their branches weighed down by the rain. The air smelled of wet earth, pine needles, and distant smoke from an unseen fire, though I was certain no one else was nearby. By the time the evening crept in, the rain had picked up again, a steady drizzle that made the undergrowth glisten under the weak light of my headlamp. The wind moved through the trees in a way that made the branches creak and groan, a sound that seemed amplified in the quiet of the forest. My rifle was slung over my shoulder, a reliable piece that had served me well in the past. Tonight, I was after deer if I was lucky. I moved carefully through the forest, my footsteps muffled by the dampness of the ground. The terrain was rough, uneven, with fallen branches and patches of thick mud that made every step uncertain. The deeper I went, the more I felt the weight of the silence pressing down on me. There were no distant howls, no rustling of animals in the underbrush, no chirping of insects, just the sound of the rain tapping against the leaves and the occasional gust of wind. I had been walking for nearly an hour when I caught sight of something ahead, movement, just beyond the trees. My heart picked up as I crouched low, raising my rifle slightly, my breath slow and steady. Through the gaps in the branches, I saw a shape, a deer, standing completely still, ears twitching as if it had sensed something. I exhaled quietly and lined up my shot. Just as I was about to squeeze the trigger, the deer bolted, not away from me, but to the side, as if something had startled it. Something other than me. I stayed in my position, frozen, listening. For the first time since I had entered the woods, I felt something strange. A shift in the air, a heaviness that I couldn't explain. I wasn't superstitious, never had been, but there was an uneasiness settling into my gut that I couldn't ignore. I turned slowly, scanning the darkness behind me, my headlamp cutting weak beams through the trees. Nothing, just the rain, the trees, the wet ground, and yet the feeling remained. I shook it off and started moving again, deciding to follow the deer's path. Maybe it had run to a more open area where I'd have a better shot. But as I walked, something gnawed at me. The way the deer had reacted, it wasn't normal. It hadn't just spooked. It had fled as if it had sensed something wrong. I pressed on, moving through the thick trees, stepping carefully over fallen logs and tangled roots. The rain had started to seep through my jacket, and the cold was settling into my bones. Every so often, I stopped to listen, straining to hear beyond the rain. Then I saw something. At first, it was just a glimpse, a shadow moving between the trees, barely visible in the dim light. I froze. My first thought was that it was another hunter, someone else out here in the middle of nowhere, but that didn't make sense. I had checked the area before I set up camp. There were no other cars, no signs of anyone nearby. I waited, breath held, watching. The shadow moved again, shifting behind a tree, disappearing for a moment before reappearing farther to the right. My grip on my rifle tightened. I wasn't alone. The rational part of my mind told me to call out, to announce my presence. Maybe it was a lost hiker, someone who had strayed too far from the trails. But the way it moved, it wasn't right. Too smooth, too controlled. Not the aimless wandering of someone lost. I took a step back, my boots sinking slightly into the wet earth. The shadow stopped. It was watching me. A shiver crawled up my spine. I had been hunting for years, spent countless nights in the wilderness, but this was different. There was something deliberate about the way it was standing there, just beyond the reach of my light. I slowly raised my rifle, not aiming, just letting whoever or whatever. It was know that I was armed. The shadow didn't move. For what felt like minutes, we stood there, locked in that moment, the rain falling between us, the wind rattling the trees. Then, without a sound, it turned and disappeared into the woods. I exhaled, my breath shaky. Every instinct told me to follow, to see what it was, but another part of me, the part that had kept me alive all these years, told me to go back to camp. I listened to that second instinct. I moved quickly, my eyes scanning every shadow, my ears straining for any sound beyond the rain. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me, and every time I turned, I half expected to see that figure again, standing just out of reach. By the time I reached my camp, the fire had nearly died, reduced to a few glowing embers. I threw more wood on, the flames crackling to life, pushing back the darkness. I stood there for a long time, rifle in hand, listening. Nothing. The rain eventually slowed, becoming a light drizzle. I forced myself to eat, to regain some of the energy I had lost, but my appetite was gone. My mind kept replaying what I had seen, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was another hunter after all. Maybe it was just some drifter, someone passing through the woods. But the way it had moved, the way it had watched me, it wasn't right. I didn't sleep much that night. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves had me gripping my rifle, my heart pounding. But nothing came. By morning, the rain had stopped, and the forest looked different in the daylight. Less threatening, more familiar. But the feeling lingered, that sense that something had been out there with me. I packed up and left earlier than planned. I never went back to that part of the woods again.